So hello fellow WalkAway Patriots. I thought I would take the opportunity in response to Brandon to make a video because apparently we are Russian bots according to the left, and I guess the video is hard to dispute. So my personal WalkAway story actually began a very long time ago, going on almost 20 years now, when I first came to the United States from Africa, Nigeria specifically, to be a college student. And at that time, I'm sort of fresh off the boat, if you will, as a student in the United States. It quickly became apparent to me that university professors had a particular worldview, a particular way of understanding the world, seeing the world, and slowly over time their particular view of the world, which naturally in most universities today is on the left, if you will, politically speaking, began to become my own, right? So I slowly began to think and to perceive the world through the lens of my professors, right? It never occurred to me at the time that these were not really thoughts I had really thought through, or I hadn't come to conclusions that were my own. Over the course of time, I began to realize that much of the arguments that were being made by students that were protesting everything from the environment to the 2000 elections, it didn't quite matter what the particular issue was. They were never really making arguments, right? They more often than not resorted to name calling, and the entire foundation of their protest, or their the things they were looking to voice, were actually just really based more on emotions and on how they wanted the world to be, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's just I never heard arguments, right, that had any kind of intellectual foundation, or things that had moorings to rationality. And even worse, though, over time it slowly began to occur to me that a lot of the intolerance and the hate, a lot of the vitriol was on the side of the political left. And so I would say that the first thing that clued me into, my own part in this sort of leftist way of thinking was I was watching the late Tim Russert on MSNBC, and he was interviewing a historian by the name of David McCullough. And David made a statement that has always stuck with me, right? He said that if you live in a society or a civilization and you know nothing of its history, right, and this is beyond just superficial knowledge, but if you know nothing of the history of the society of which you are a part, you will inevitably walk around with the outlook of a child, right? And this was a very good definition of sort of my own outlook. It was childish. I could not articulate why I believed the things that I did, the things I chanted. And quite honestly, it occurred to me that I did not really know anything. I did not know anything. And so I began a journey to really studying history in depth, right? And became a big fan and a student of history. And as I studied history, I quickly began to realize that the modern American left, right, have a lot of their intellectual foundation in the Marxists of the last century, right? Ronald Reagan once said that if fascism came to America, that it would come in the name of liberalism, and I do this because I recognize that there are classical liberals in the United States and actually share a lot of their way of thinking, right? And classical liberalism is something that I distinguish from modern leftists, if you will. Someone who's done a very fine job articulating classical liberalism would be Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report. You should look him up. Dave is doing fine work, right? But the modern American left and leftist ideology, if you will, it's almost like a religion. It's not just here at home, right, but it's global as well. And the forces that are on the march today globally are the forces that are acting against freedom, against individualism, right? The ability and the capacity of the individual to be the source from which all truth comes from, if you will, right? As opposed to collectivism, which has a lot of dogma that the moment you deviate from, you are ostracized, you are called names, and in some ways you're persecuted for it. Um, I've often found it ironic among my own family members that for 20 years, even my own brothers, I don't know that it's ever actually occurred to them, you know, that a lot of the intolerance and a lot of the hate speech comes from the left, right? And the irony of it is they've done this sort of bait and switch sort of thing in the United States, where they've constantly pointed to the other side as the side of intolerance and the side of racism, you know, and so on, and all the isms out there. But there's a growing movement that is, I think, a bigger sort of story, and I think the WalkAway movement is a part of this larger movement of Americans that are realizing that, look, our ultimate strength as a society, as a civilization, doesn't so much derive from our diversity, right? As it derives from our ability as millions of people of diverse backgrounds, of diverse faiths, diverse religions, and whatnot, to forge an American identity out of that diversity, right? That's really where American strength comes from. And the modern left, ultimately, I think, is seeking to undo much of the American Revolution. You know, I heard a fine man argue some things along these lines recently, and I fully agree with him. You know, that the left is looking to undo the American Revolution. But this challenge is not just here; it's here and abroad. You know, all across Europe, this is an ongoing challenge. And so, Brandon, I want to just thank you for the courage it took to begin this, right? And for all of you who are out there, you know, the question for me is, where do we go from here? You know, I consider myself one of you. And for starters, I would say we should never resort to the kind of name-calling, the kind of animosity that those on the left often show us, right? They are just as trapped in this sort of mental thing, right, as many of us once were, you know, and we weren't beaten or forced or insulted out of our sort of deception, right? However our own individual stories are, I highly doubt that any of us would really say we were forced out of that or insulted out of it, right? It was little things that began the unraveling for us, right? Many of us, it's realizing that a lot of the intolerance was from the side of, you know, that says they are the tolerant one, and so on and so forth. And so when I think about where we go from here, at the moment I'm kind of formulating a lot of my own thoughts along those lines, but I do know this, that we need to realize that you cannot cast out hate with hate, right? And that you have to show kindness and actually love, right, where you are insulted, where you are mistreated, because someday they will realize that the intolerance is really, you know, on their side. And as more and more people come out of that, they need to find a place and have a place, just like we are finding, you know, to come to. So please let us not resort to the same kind of social media bullshit, name calling, that is just, you know, I mean, the internet is replete with this stuff, right? And I don't want any one of us that have come out and have walked away to resort to the same things, you know. And then secondly, I think we all need to continue to grow in our education of what it means to be American, right? And we need to grow in each of our abilities to articulate why individualism and freedom is really the only hope for the future, right? You know, because we need to learn how to win arguments. You know, Margaret Thatcher used to say, you first win the argument and then you win the vote. So I want all of us who are walking away to grow in our ability to articulate, right, why we believe what we believe, you know, and to respond in kindness and in love towards the other side. Because I'm hopeful. You know, I did not vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 elections. Neither did my wife. But I can say this, I am very much looking forward to voting for the man in 2020. Simply because of more what he stands for. Yeah, I may not like a couple of things here and there that he says, but that's not really relevant. There are bigger issues at hand. And his presidency, I believe, means, above all things in my mind, the genesis or the beginning of sort of breaking the back of the spirit of intimidation, right, that has had sway in this country for the last 20 years, 30 years. And it's gotten worse, right? And that's what I think his presidency stands for. That political correctness is a far worse bondage to be in, right? And that we each need to recognize that it takes courage to stand up to be counted and to say that we are drawing a line in the sand. We need to be free to be who we are, to think what we think, right? And the muzzling of the left is something that has to be defeated. And so our enemy aren't the people that are trapped in this, right? It is the ideas and the spirit behind those ideas that are the enemy, if there is such a thing. So I just want to say thank you, Brandon, and I'm very excited that this is happening, and I'm very glad to be a part of it. God bless.